Okay, so for the last of the three sort of main branches of ethical theory that we're covering in this course, we're going to talk about virtue ethics. So virtue ethics, it's a little different. So far, we've examined ethical theories that are primarily concerned with evaluating particular actions according to certain standards. So consequentialist moral theories ask us to evaluate the moral status of an action based on the consequences it brings about. Deontological moral theories ask us to evaluate an action in relation to certain moral rules or theories of rights. And both consequentialist and deontological theories can be characterized as sort of concerned with the quality of particular acts, asking questions about whether certain decisions or certain outcomes or certain actions were morally good or bad. Virtue ethics takes a different approach and asks us to focus on the agents themselves and on the character qualities of those agents. So rather than focus on a particular act, we might ask about the kind of person who committed the act, or what sort of character qualities this person possessed that led them to acting in this way. So virtue ethics in this way takes a more sort of holistic and agent-centered approach than the other theories that we've discussed. Now, this doesn't mean that theories of virtue are absent from either consequentialist or deontological theories, only that virtue ethics is defined as sort of having virtue as its central or guiding concern. So virtues might still matter in some sort of consequentialist theory or deontological Kantian style moral theory. They just might not be, they're not going to be the sort of measuring stick that we use in those theories. And virtue ethics is also notable for being the most ancient of the three primary branches of ethical theory that we cover in this course. It's something that in the past sort of 30 or 40 years has seen a resurgence, but it's a very old, very ancient style of thinking about ethical problems and very ancient style of ethical theory. Okay, so first, what is a virtue? I think when we think of virtues, we tend to think of maybe positive character traits, things that we think are admirable in other people or in ourselves. And this common understanding, I think, fits fairly well with virtue as we're going to discuss it in this class, but we should, fill that picture out a little bit more. So very broadly, we might say virtues are positive character traits that are stably possessed to the point of becoming a habit or a disposition that you have. So for example, we only call someone an honest person if they are in a very stable habit of acting honestly the vast majority of the time. Or in other words, if they have the disposition to behave honestly. So to possess a virtue involves being a certain kind of person. And being a certain kind of person involves a particular state of mind or internal mental state, which involves the consideration of particular reasons for action and the valuing of particular things. So for example, we would say someone possesses the virtue of honesty if they act honestly because they value it as a way of behaving and as a way of living. They value living an honest life, not because they believe acting honestly is just in their best interest or they're simply afraid of the consequences of lying. So we're going to say someone has the virtue of honesty when they tell the truth because they love living the truthful life, not when they tell the truth because they're really scared that someone's going to get mad at them if they don't. So in virtue ethics, someone's reasons for action matter very much because it's those internal reasons which kind of form into particular virtuous character traits. So being virtuous is not just about doing the right thing, but it's about doing the right thing for the right sorts of reasons and also having the right sorts of dispositions and values. So another important thing to know about virtues is, and what it means to possess virtues, is that it tends to come as a matter of degree. So it's rare to possess a virtue fully or perfectly, right? So even honest people, those who we would rightfully describe as honest people, tell lies sometimes, or they fall short of this perfect ideal. And virtue ethicists, of course, people who write in virtue ethics know this. And so they talk about the fully virtuous person, and they draw a distinction between the fully virtuous person, the sort of moral exemplar is a term that you might hear, and what they call the continent person. And so the fully virtuous person is one who acts morally or virtuously with no internal struggle. So they have no desire to act otherwise. They have kind of the perfect internal state. They value the right things. And so for them to act virtuously, there's no real friction. There's no conflict. Now the continent person is one who might still act virtuously, but they do so with a certain strength of will. So they're one who maybe acts virtuously, but they have to exercise self-control to overcome desires to act otherwise. So the continent person is one who is going to be honest, but they still might have the urge to lie. So that's a distinction that some virtue ethicists are going to draw. Now, another important thing when we're trying to act virtuously or become the perfectly virtuous person, because for a lot of virtue ethicists, like for Aristotle, the goal is sort of to become excellently virtuous, to become a perfectly virtuous person. And you do this through habituating yourself to virtue, through practice, and often through selecting a moral exemplar, someone who is perfectly virtuous, to model your behaviors after as a way of learning. But in order to act virtuously, you also need something which Aristotle calls phronesis, which is defined as moral or practical wisdom. And this is the kind of moral knowledge that allows you to properly recognize what the virtuous action in a situation would be. Sorry. And which allows you to have the correct values, and then because you have these correct values, behave in the right way. These might then result in the right action. So this sort of moral knowledge might also be understood as a kind of wisdom. It's something that you gain with more life experience, which the thought being that as you spend more time navigating your own life, you have more chances to learn what is truly worthwhile, what's important, and you learn more of what is required to live well, which living well is going to be a big topic that we talk about in a later video when we talk more about Aristotle specifically, but that's a big goal in virtue ethics. So, some objections to virtue ethics is that it's not guiding enough. The sort of main objection to virtue ethics, and this takes different forms, is that it's not guiding enough. So like we said in the beginning, unlike deontological ethics, say Kantian ethics, which offers the categorical imperative as a guiding principle, or utilitarianism, which offers something like the greatest happiness principle as a way to guide our actions, sort of a rule that we can model ourselves after. Virtue ethics doesn't have a similar sort of principle that you can use to guide your actions and decide whether something is right or wrong. And part of this, like we said earlier, is due to the character-focused nature of virtue ethics. So another way of putting this issue, another angle you might take, is that for the person who does not already have a well-developed character, for the person who does not have the sort of moral knowledge and the habits of virtue necessary to act rightly and to act like a good person, they might end up behaving in morally bad ways, and because they lack this moral knowledge, they might not have a way to guide themselves out of this bad behavior, or they might not even know that they are acting badly. And so another way of putting the issue is to say, well, it seems like you already have to be a virtuous person in order to act well. And so how do you get to that point? What do the rest of us do when we are lacking in moral knowledge and lacking in virtue? So the virtue ethicist is probably going to respond to this by saying that, well, of course we understand that most people are not perfectly virtuous, they are lacking in practical or moral knowledge, but all these people need to do is identify a moral exemplar. They need to identify someone who is perfectly virtuous and then act as that person would act. Use their imagination and say, what would this person do in this situation? I'll do that. So, for example, when I was in high school or middle school, it was popular for a while to wear these certain bracelets that said WWJD on them. And that stood for, what would Jesus do? And this is a sort of catchy way of asking a very virtue ethics style of question, because it asks you to, one, to see Jesus as a moral exemplar, and then to ask yourself what he would do in similar situations in order to guide your own actions. And this is what the virtue ethicist might ask you to do. So just find a really good person, do as they do, problem solved. Well, the objection might say, okay, well, maybe not so easily, because this seems to raise another few issues. One is the question of how you can be sure that you are identifying a good moral exemplar to model your behavior after, particularly if you lacked the kind of moral knowledge necessary to be perfectly virtuous yourself. If you aren't perfectly virtuous yourself and you're lacking in the required knowledge, then how can you be sure that you're picking a person who is acting virtuously? It seems like you could make a mistake. And a related issue is, how can you be sure, say you do successfully pick a perfect moral exemplar to model your behavior after, how can you be sure that using your own imagination you would know what they would do in the kind of situations that you're seeking guidance in? So once again, because you yourself are lacking in, you're not perfectly virtuous, or you don't have perfect moral knowledge, you might say you're unlikely to be able to accurately predict what the fully virtuous person would do. So these are some objections, some common objections that come up. Of course, when I introduce objections, I'm not suggesting that you should agree or see them as, defeating the theory. Just trying to give you a sense of some of the ongoing debate around some of these issues and some of these moral theories. So that's a basic kind of rundown of some of the key points within virtue ethics. Like I said, it's very ancient, but there's many different flavors of virtue ethics. Some of the revival in the past 30 years of virtue ethics has been Aristotelian, a sort of Aristotelian style of virtue ethics, but there are many other branches of virtue ethics that exist. There's a rich tradition of Platonic virtue ethics that comes down from Plato, Stoic virtue ethics, Christian virtue ethics, and also Confucian virtue ethics as well. And I'm sure I'm missing several with that small sort of truncated list. But I'm going to have you read some excerpts from Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics for this course, and so we'll get into more detail about his particular style of virtue ethics in another video.